Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a pleasure for me to welcome you here today for the second day of our international conference on cultural diplomacy in the European Union. Crisis, conflict, and culture. The role of cultural diplomacy in the European project. We had a wonderful day yesterday where we had the chance really to learn from European perspectives as well as Asian perspectives and from around the world in terms of the significance that culture can play both within the EU as well as the EU working externally. And I'm very happy to be able to continue the excellent tradition that we began yesterday with our opening keynote address from Professor Pieter Lagrou from the Free University of Brussels. I'd like to say a few words of introduction about Professor Lagrou. He holds a BA in History from the University of Louvain, a master's degree in History from Yale University, and a PhD in History from the University of Louvain. From 1990 until 1998, he held doctoral and postdoctoral positions at the European University Institute in Florence, the University of Louvain, and the Belgian National Fund for Scientific Research. From 1998 until 2003, he was a researcher at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, Institut d'Histoire du Temps Présent in Paris, in France. In 2003, he became lecturer at the Free University of Brussels, and in 2005, he became head of the Department of History and Cultures of Europe at the university's Institute for European Studies. In 2010, he became full professor. Professor Lagrou also was awarded a professorship at the Institut des Études Politiques de Paris, known as Sciences Po, in the year 2009. The lecture topic that he's chosen today, I think, will be an excellent one for us to begin our day with really a historical foundation before we enter more into the political science and international relations later today. The title he's chosen is Historical Foundations of the European Energy Policy from Today and Today's Implications. I'm sorry, it's tomorrow morning. It didn't fit so much to the historian. So he's getting nervous as he has to speak on a topic he doesn't know. The correct title, excuse me for that, Language Policy, a tool for conflict or communication, question mark. Historical perspectives on linguistic diversity in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very, very warm welcome for Dr. Pieter Lagrou. Thank you.
So first of all, I want to thank the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy for this great opportunity to be in such a prestigious room and to be able to talk to you. I'm normally very disciplined when it comes to timing, so if I look on the schedule, my time is over and we should go pass now to the discussion. Just so I will try to be brief, even though it is a huge subject, of course. Linguistic diversity is without doubt one of the most striking characteristics of the European Union as a political entity. And it is certainly a characteristic that deserves a critical historical examination. How did this linguistic diversity come into being, and how can we deal with it in the future, constructively, as a main asset and not as a handicap for this political entity? I want to start with just two short quotes. First, drawn from Ernest Gellner's great book on nations and nationalism. He says somewhere in this book, well, Arab speakers and Slavic speakers somehow live in an opposite illusion. All Arab speakers, from Yemen to Morocco, live in the illusion that they speak the same language, though obviously they cannot understand each other. Well, Slavic speakers, they all live in the illusion that they all speak different languages, while, after all, the difference between the different Slavic languages from Dubrovnik to Vladivostok is certainly not bigger than the variations in Arab from Yemen to Morocco. How can we explain these different illusions? The second one, characteristic, certainly for Europe. Well, there is another short quote by Gianrenzo Clivio, who is a linguist, and who questions the difference between a dialect and a language. And we can have lengthy discussions, and linguists very often engage in these debates. What is the difference between a dialect and a language? Now, Gianrenzo Clivio has a definition that suits historians very well. A language is a dialect with an army. Well, I think that these are good starting points to think about linguistic diversity in Europe. I will just make 5 brief observations. first stress the historical exception of monolingualism, the situation whereby all people in one society speak the same language, whatever it is they are doing. Secondly, to stress that monolingualism is a creation of the modern nation state. Thirdly, look how modern nation states have both been emancipating the masses, nationalizing the masses, but also configuring new national elites through language policy. Fourth point will be on language and sovereignty. Who owns the language? Who decides what is proper and what is improper use of a language? And to conclude, in a fifth point, I will try to make some observations on democracy and language in the European Union. From this historical perspective, what can we now say about how the European Union could deal with linguistic diversity? So first of all, the historical exception of monolingualism. Again, Gellner makes this very useful distinction between horizontal and vertical segmentation in language use that characterizes pre-modern and pre-national societies. Well, vertical segmentations means that from one village to the other village, there are slight changes in language, and the farther you move, the more difficult it becomes to understand each other. Pre-modern societies are characterized by local dialects and local differences. More interesting, there are also vertical segmentation between the language of the village, the language of family life, then the language of religion, which can be Latin, Arab, Hebrew, Church Slavonic, the German of Luther's Bible, etc. Languages of administration, Ottoman, Russian, German, Polish. Languages of culture, Latin, German, French, Polish, etc. Language of trade. Well, in pre-modern settings, most often there were different languages for each of these uses, depending whether you were in the family, in the temple, in the administration, in court, or in high culture. So people were dealing with these different languages in different situations. Nothing was more normal. Some alarmist writing on the new challenges of children growing up with different languages at home and in the school is, after all, what was the average situation in Europe, very often until the 1950s at least. So how did we get national languages and monolingualism? Well, and this is my second point, of course this is a heritage from the French Revolution. It is something resolutely modern. Well, the French Revolution proclaims that the people are sovereign. Through Napoleonic conquest, they then export the revolution all over Europe, where it is very often welcomed in a form of patriotic constitutionalism or constitutional patriotism. People welcome these liberal constitutions that Napoleon brings about, but at the same time, there is increasing resistance that freedom and democracy can not only come on the point of a French bayonet, and that French is not the only language of freedom. So Napoleonic conquest sets off a linguistic movement. Where does the people start? Where does the people stop? What does make a people that would then be sovereign? Well, this is increasingly linked to language, and especially Napoleonic conquest of Germany sets off the work of linguists. What it means to be sovereign in Germany is also to have our own language. And the idea that if a modern state has to arise in the regions where people speak German, the language would be the main element, the foundational element of what this new nation would be. And hence a very strong idea of the total coincidence between a language and a nation. Because it is a democracy. As long as you have dictatorship or absolute monarchy, you don't need a common language. Democracy supposes, requires a unified public space, and thus a common language. Of course, the Industrial Revolution, and especially once the Industrial Revolution, by the end of the 19th century, becomes more and more service-based. That is, when in order to get a job, you do not only need your hands, but you need to master the language. Of course, the social economic, and political importance of the national language only increases and will set off numerous conflicts. Rushing to the third point. Well, how do national states create national languages? It is all about emancipating the masses, but it is also, at the same time, about configuring the elites. The first point, emancipating the masses. Well, there is a famous, even though apocryphal, quote from Giuseppe Mazzini in 1861. Apocryphal means he probably never said it, but in Italian they say, se non è vero, è ben trovato. If it's not true, it is very, very well thought of. So Giuseppe Mazzini would have said during the first meeting of the Italian parliament, Italy is just unified. Fatto l'Italia, adesso dobbiamo fare gli italiani. We have made Italy, but now we still have to make Italians. Now, that is a funny quote, of course. Why would Mazzini say such a thing? Well, to start with, because only 2 to 3% of the Italians at that time speak Italian. And if Mazzini has a project of a modern, liberal, secular Italian state, emancipating the Italian peasants both from the influence of the church and from the influence of their landlords and turn them into modern citizens, well, you need to be able to reach them. And you will only be able to reach them if they can understand, speak, and read proper Italian. And that, of course, has also to do simply with literacy. The modern state and active citizenship is, of course, tied to literacy. If you have illiterate peasants speaking only a local dialect, what use calling them to elections so that they can tick a cross in a box without knowing what they are doing? So active citizenship proclaimed under the French Revolution will only become a reality through universal schooling, learning to read and to write, and learning the national language. And that, in all European nations, only becomes a reality by the end of the 19th century. So the first instrument to produce a national language and to produce national citizens is the school. And this, of course, is related to suffrage. This is why only a minority has the right to vote in the beginning of the 19th century, even though we are after democratic revolutions. It is only once literacy, once an entire generation goes to school, learns the language, learns to write and to read, that they can also become really active citizens and have the right to vote. So the school, the suffrage, and also the military service become these central instruments to emancipate, well, the peasants. And this is a famous sentence and the title of a book by Eugene Weber in France, Turning Peasants into Frenchmen. Well, this is not something that happens in 1789, it happens only at the end of the 19th century. And you are emancipating these peasants from backwardness, clericalism, dialect, provincial identities, and turning them into modern Frenchmen, including and even especially if they don't want so. It is the mission of the state to turn them into citizens, even if they don't want to. So it is a very, in a way, repressive and authoritarian project. And a project that is characterized by deep contempt for dialects and regional languages. One we can find, of course, in this French Republic, the French Third Republic, but interestingly, we also find it in the father of modern Greek, Diamantios Koryais, saying that the Greek the peasants speak is polluted by Byzantine and Ottoman influences. We have to purify it and create a true pure language. We find it with Mustafa Kemal, who wants to switch to a Latin alphabet and purify the Turkish language. And we find it interesting very strongly with Theodor Herzl in his idea of Zionism is emancipating the Jews from the ghetto languages, eradicating Yiddish. This will be the central mission of the teachers of the new Zionist state, eradicating all the languages of the ghettos, all those inferior dialects, and elevate them to a language of culture, which for Theodor Herzl is German and not Hebrew. We'll come back to this if there is time. So it is a very repressive project, and in a way, one can say that whatever the language, whatever the national standard is, it takes the same degree of repression. It didn't take more or less repression to turn Algeria into an Arab-speaking country than it would have taken to turn it into a French-speaking country. And in a way, turning it into an Arab-speaking country could only increase the tensions between the Arab and the Berber population. It did take the same amount of effort and repression to turn Flanders into a Dutch-speaking region than it would have taken to turn it into a French-speaking region. However outrageous this would seem to most nationalists, be it in Algeria or in Flanders. So we are talking about the language of the people, which never is the language of the people. The language of the people are a multiplicity of local dialects, and any national project is not about emancipating the people, allowing them to speak their own language. It is about imposing them to speak another language. But which language? And one could say, well, after all, it's totally indifferent. In Algeria, whether they choose French or Arabic, in Flanders, whether they choose Flemish or Dutch or French, or they could have chosen Hungarian, it would have been the same? Of course not. There is a question of how removed the standard is from languages that are spoken. But you can then also configure a very difficult language, very inaccessible, making it only accessible for a small elite that goes to secondary schooling, or you can try to make it into a democratic language. This is the central conflict in modern Greece between Katarevousa, the artificial language designed by Adamantios Kouriais, as close as possible to the language of Pericles, and as far removed as possible from what this bastard tongue polluted by Byzantine and Ottoman influences, or you can have Demotiki. Katarevousa, the language, the official language of Greek independence, is very difficult. It takes secondary schooling to master it. So if you want to have access to a public job, to parliament, to the elite, well, you have to undergo this intensive schooling. If you choose a more accessible standard, like the Demotiki, the popular language, well, you have a much more democratic society. And we can see this over and over again. We see this clearly, of course, in Spain. Habla Cristiano, habla Castellano, which means if you don't speak Castilian, you're a barbarian. You're not even a Christian. You're as one of the savages of the empire. We have the same with Oxbridge English, where your accents become the finest marker of belonging to a social elite. And you have this in Dutch. Dutch, which the standard was called until 20 years ago, Algemeen Beschaafd Nederlands. General, civilized Dutch, meaning if you speak anything else than this, you are not a civilized person. You are a savage, you are a peasant. So language as a social marker is the most effective tool for social discrimination. Democratizing language is also about democratizing society. And this is why, for instance, the Rechtschreibreform in Germany in the 1980s is so exciting. It is a project, and that is then taken up in different countries, to simplify grammar rules and orthography, make it simpler to write correctly, which then has the effect of democratizing society. Because if you send a letter in poor German with spelling mistakes, you are in a way socially disqualified. You do not belong to the society. So why do we make spelling artificially complicated if we can make it more democratic? And there's a very interesting debate on who owns the language. There is, and I'll come back to this in my last point. Well, in the second point, which is about language and sovereignty. Who owns the language? Well, in the emergence of new nation states all through the 19th and 20th centuries, the central claim of these new nation states was that they had ownership of the language. And what this then set off was a process of symbolical differentiation, saying we do not speak the same language as any other sovereign country, and the language we have full sovereignty over it. I will just start with the most recent examples, of course, which are Kosovar and Moldovan. In the Republic of Kosovo, the language is Albanian, but that is a deficit of sovereignty for the new state. So also to deny that there is behind this a project of a greater Albania, there is a decision made that the language of Kosovo is Kosovar, even though it is a variety, a form of Albanian. But there is a big effort being made to differentiate Kosovar from Albanian, and because this is a very recent state, this is still very much under debate. The same can be said for the Republic of Moldova, where the official language is Moldovan. And even though we all know that Moldovan is Romanian, but they are now making dictionaries translating from Romanian into Moldovan, which is also a form of saying this is about sovereignty. And also because it would be difficult if the official language of Moldova was Romanian, then Transnistria, where you have Russian speakers, they would probably separate from this new state. So symbolical differentiation is hugely important. But it is not limited to those, in a way, exotic periphery of recent states in Europe. If we see the whole movement set off by Napoleonic conquest and the whole debate in Europe between 1815 and 1848, when the failure of the Parliament of Frankfurt somehow stops this elan, well, one can say from 1789 till Waterloo, the defeat of Napoleon, French is the language of emancipation. Between 1815 and 1848, to a large degree, German becomes the language of emancipation because this French project has failed. And there is then an intense debate on the standard for modern German and who belongs to this German family that wants to become a state. You have Hochdeutsch, and then you have Plattdeutsch, and then you have Niederdeutsch. But there is a whole debate. The Dutch, the language now called Dutch, is not Deutsch, it's not German, but it is Nederlandisch, it is Nederlands. Why? Well, because until 1870, when Germany became a sovereign state, the Dutch called themselves their own language Nederduits, Niederdeutsch, a lower German variant. And this was no problem as long as there was no German state. We are part of a Germanic family, and we are a lower German language. As soon as you have a German state with claims of sovereignty over the language, it becomes dangerous to say that you are speaking Niederdeutsch, because it's an invitation for annexation. If the language defines the nation, you have to differentiate yourself. And we can then see that there are ongoing debates. Well, the Swiss, finally, they speak Schweizerdeutsch, but the official standard is still German. The Luxembourgers, they say that Letzeburgisch is a language, but they decided very late, only in the 20th century. But so we can see that this symbolic differentiation is an ongoing process. And of course, it is central to the symbolic differentiation of Slavic languages. Slavic nations never had political union. They have no shared sacred text because they are divided between Orthodox and Catholics with different translations, different alphabets, different versions of the Bible. And of course, the differentiation between Czech and Slovak, is this an artificial creation? Many claim so. And there was something like Czechoslovak that was being strongly promoted by the Czechoslovak independent state that came into being in 1918. And of course, we all know about Serbo-Croat, different alphabet but the same language, a strong political ambition to differentiate them and to obtain simultaneous translation. From Serbian into Croatian, the European Union will soon have to build a lot of new of these little translation cabins in their buildings if enlargement goes on. The same with Macedonian, of course. What is Macedonian? Is Macedonian a Bulgarian accent? But Tito tried to convince them that they were not speaking a Bulgarian accent because he was afraid that Bulgaria would again annex Macedonia as it had done in 1912 and in 1941. Or is Macedonian a language? Well, we here see that any question of language differentiation is a political question. And we could go on with the Scandinavian languages, where Danish, the two forms of Norwegian, Nynorsk and Bokmål, and Swedish are in the same kind of constellations. It is nationalism that set them apart. Well, of course, that doesn't mean that everything is arbitrary. We have what they say Ausbausprache and Abstandsprache. That is, we have a dialectical continuum in a Germanic space, in a Latin space, in a Scandinavian space, and nobody could pretend that Hungarian and Czech are very close. Still, we see many forms of hybridization. And what we see especially is that since national standards have been defined at the moment, at the age of nationalism, the choice has systematically been to eliminate hybridization. That is, mixed forms where words of Arab and Magyar and Slavic and Latin and German are part of the language, to expunge them and to create pure languages, thereby making communication more difficult. And all the innumerable linguistic and vocabulary bridges that existed between European languages have been blown up by nationalist standards very much. And we still have some cases like Romanian, a fascinating bridge language with elements of Latin and Slavic and more. We even have more extreme forms, but that is simply linguistic invention, not purifying a spoken language, but simply inventing one or reinventing one. Hebrew is a clear case. Theodor Herzl himself said, hey, be serious, nobody will ever buy a train ticket in Hebrew. That is the language of the sacred text. Nobody knows enough Hebrew, we cannot buy this. It would even be an insult to Hebrew to buy a train ticket in Hebrew. Well, still, it worked. In the end, something even the father of Zionism didn't believe, became a national language. We can say that Nynorsk and Katarevusa, so the artificial pure forms of Norwegian and of Greek, are also artificial invented languages. Sometimes it works, and for the case of Hebrew, quite unbelievable. Sometimes it fails, like Katarevusa, but only after the fall of the authoritarian regime of the colonels in the 1970s. But we have other failed attempts. Gaelic is an official language of the European Union, but it is hardly spoken in Ireland. And the children who learn Gaelic in school cannot speak with their grandparents because it is a different linguistic standards. Esperanto is another of these utopian projects that failed. Who then owns the language? And this is my last point before the conclusion. Who owns the language? Who is linguistically sovereign? Well, we have at least three models. We have the imperial model. The imperial model is really incarnated by the Académie Française. Who owns the French language? It is the Académie Française, created by Louis XIV. And in spite of revolutions, colonial collapse, the Académie Française is still there. And if you are living in Switzerland, in Belgium, or in Canada, you have nothing to say about the language. You don't own your language. You are in a situation of imperial submission to Paris, who can decide sovereignly. And then, of course, in imperial greatness, the Académie Française can invite some authors from the periphery into its sanctum, but clearly this is the imperial model, still very strong for the French language, and uncontested by those Swiss and Belgians and Africans and Canadians who submit to its authority. Then we have cases of shared sovereignty. Very interestingly, what happens in 1870 when the Dutch decide that they can no longer call their language Nederduits, because that is an invitation for a German invasion. They then call it Nederlands, which is the name for a country, not for a language. So what do the Flemish then do? They are, in a way, hostile to the country of Nederland. They have fought a war against the Netherlands in 1830. And all of a sudden, their language has the name of a country that is not theirs. So there is a moment of hesitation. What will be the strategy of the Flemish movement? Are we going for Flemish, like almost all of these national movements have done, or do we opt for Nederlands? In the end, they opt for Nederlands. Belatedly, in 1980, they obtain a political concession, that is the linguistic union, the Taalunie. Who is sovereign over the linguistic standards of Nederlands? It is the Netherlands, Belgium, and later even the country of Suriname. Interestingly enough, apartheid South Africa refused to become part of this union, saying that Afrikaans is a language and is not part of Nederlands. We see the same with this Internationaler Arbeitskreis für Rechtschreibreform. In the 1980s, in the middle of the Cold War, there is an international working group for simplifying German spelling. Who is invited? West Germany, East Germany, across the Cold War divide, but also Austria, Switzerland. Luxembourg is invited, but they reply indignantly, how dare you? We are not German speakers, we speak Letzeburgs. But so there is an international shared sovereignty. If we change the spelling, it is not in Bonn that it can be done. It is not in Berlin, it is not in Vienna. We have to discuss. Very interesting idea, but then it backfires because there is popular resistance to saying, well, this international working group wants to democratize spelling, but we are very attached to the bizarre and sometimes complicated forms of Old German. So there are referenda, there are court cases where spelling is at the heart of a debate on who owns the German language. Absolutely fascinating. And then we have other models where there is no government control and no clear sovereignty, which is maybe one of the explanations of the tremendous success of English as an international language. Well, to come to my conclusion, if we can have no democracy without a unified public space and a common language, the European Union will fail as a democracy. But what I have tried to argue in these 20 minutes is that what can be made can be unmade. If national languages could be made artificially in a repressive way by eradicating dialects, well, they can probably also be unmade. Do we have to go ever further in this symbolical differentiation, making communication more difficult instead of more easy between different nations of the European Union? Of course, it was quite easy to eradicate dialects, which were pre-modern, pre-national languages, not invested with national identities. Today we are faced with official national languages that have been turned into the cornerstone of national identity. Tell to a Slovak that his language is not real language, but just a Czech dialect, and that they should stop talking about all this symbolical differentiation. You will get a warm reception in Bratislava. Still, we have to think on the governance of modern languages. Can we still allow that nation-states claim total ownership of languages? Can we continue this model of national control and political sovereignty in a European continent characterized by migration, where people speaking languages no longer live on the territory of these sovereign states, where the written word is being increasingly competed and rivaled by new uses of language on the internet, on TV? Very interesting, as long as there was a public monopoly of TV, this was the official language. Commercial TV has many divergent standards, not only Oxbridge English on the BBC, but also Cockney on Channel 4. Well, aren't we now witnessing an enormous increase of hybridization, both in the internet, new international languages that escape government control, and locally, I think, a new vitality of dialects and local languages? I think we need today to hail the return of multilingualism to Europe and to hail this as a return to normalcy. Multilingualism is not a problem, is not a challenge for schools and government institutions. It is absolutely normal, and it is a tremendous opportunity. It is a tremendous enrichment of cultural horizons to be exposed to different languages, as most human beings have been all through human history, between the language of the village, the language of trade, the language of religion, the language of the state, and those different languages of culture which we can freely choose. And isn't that a tremendous form of freedom we should cherish? Now, new aims, radically different from the bulldozer of monolingualism that the nation state was. But I think we only have very old tools, and one tool I can see is the very same tool of the French Third Republic, the very same tool that Theodor Herzl was invoking when he wanted to eradicate Yiddish. It is the school. The school was the main instrument of monolingualism. We have to turn the school today into the main instrument for multilingualism, showing how fantastic it is for children to be able, in school, to learn the language of the house and the language of the country they live in, languages of culture. And I think that this is the challenge, and this is a challenge for the European Union as such. And of course, school policy is still jealously guarded by nation states. But I think that in a future European Union, language policy has to be deterritorialized, schooling has to be retaught, and we have to cherish this fantastic diversity of Europe that starts with linguistic diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation and an excellent start to the day. Be happy to take one or two questions, as always.
Politics decides what is a national language. And politics decide that Macedonian is a language and not a Bulgarian dialect. Can decide that Moldovan is a language. And it can decide that the language of the Flemish national movement will be Dutch instead of Flemish or French or whatever. So it is a political decision. Linguists might disagree, but even some linguists say a language is a dialect with an army. And I think that clarifies the matter. It is about politics, and we have to be very aware of that. What is preferable for any given state, to have one or more languages? Well, it is a question of how many official standards do you have? Because people are always speaking divergent languages and dialects, and there is no single country where everybody speaks the Hoch language, the official variant. The question today is no longer for a single state. The question is for the European Union. And since so much of our decision-making is now on a European level, multilingualism is there, and I think it is there to stay. So, what about Esperanto? Why did Esperanto fail? Well, quite simply because there was no state behind it. Which languages have succeeded? Those who had the big machinery, well, they had the army. Esperanto didn't have an army. They didn't have school teachers who were beating children if they were speaking dialect. So it was a utopian movement, but without the tremendous disciplining force of a nation state. And it's sad to conclude this, but indeed, in order to get a language to succeed, it needs the support of a state, of a school system, and of the immense ways of disciplining and repressing that our modern nation states have. What about multilingual education? And isn't this going to be horribly complicated? Well, my concern with language is also a concern with democracy and with equal access to the public space. If you have a very complicated, artificially complicated official language, you are creating barriers for children from families who have less contact with the official written version of the language. And so if you look at Italian spelling, how wonderfully simple it is. Seeing all the pains I went through to learn this absurd spelling in Dutch, I think, well, can't we think of the Italian model of if you hear a word, you know how can it be written? So yes, there is a challenge of democratic access to white-collar jobs for people and not creating artificial barriers by making languages complicated. But now there is a new barrier. That is multilingualism. If you need a good job, if you want a good job, one language won't do. So either we say, well, we have public education, you learn the local language. And if you want to learn another language, you better have rich parents that can afford private tutoring to learn other languages or send you to a language school in Britain or in Switzerland or wherever. Or we can say that since multilingualism is now at the core of our European public space, it is the public school system who has to offer it. Now, if the Luxembourgers can do it with 3 languages, I don't think the Luxembourg kids are smarter than kids in Poland or in Portugal. Any school can do it. And we are investing so much in mathematics, and of course we need to be able to go. But can't we make this into a central challenge for Europe? Learn different languages. And no official nomenclatura of everybody will learn English, French, and German, and then the Spanish will be frustrated, and we might think of Polish also. Let there be maximum flexibility. I'm thinking of a city like Brussels, where there is fantastic linguistic diversity. And then you have an elite system of European schools, where if your parents speak Slovene because they work for the European Union, they are entitled to have school in Slovenian. But if you are Turkish or Moroccan, you don't have this right. And it is perfectly possible to create a school system where students can choose. We now have the absurd system where students in Belgium, and including in the European school system, can choose their religion classes. They can choose Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Islamic, etc. But they cannot choose their languages. If we can offer this freedom of choice for religions, why can't we for languages? We have so many native speakers who can teach it. It should be a challenge that all European children, wherever they live, have access as early as possible to 1, 2, 3 other languages. Now, compare Indonesia to the European Union, and of what kind of models can we think. And now, this is a bit depressing, because I can think of models, but these models failed. It is the Soviet Union and Habsburg Empire, which had linguistic diversity and quite inventive ways of dealing with different languages. Now, both polities failed. Did they fail because of multilingualism? I am not so sure. And I think that, including in the Habsburg Empire, it was very exciting tinkering and experimenting going on with multilingualism and multinationalism in one unified citizenship. And in a way, even in the Soviet Union, this happened. Whatever we can say about Russocentric authoritarianism, etc. So it's a bit depressing to say, well, my examples are failed examples, but please let us try to be inventive. And I think, in a way, yes, the Soviet Union and the Habsburg Empire, when it comes to language policies, are more exciting examples than the French Third Republic. It's not very popular to say so, but let's be brave and let's take the intellectual risk to say so that, yes, we have to think creatively about linguistic diversity and the link with politics today in the European Union. Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions.